The Carroll house stood silent at the edge of Waller County, once filled with laughter, now only wind slipping through its rotted frames. When Officer George and his German shepherd Zane stepped inside, the air felt heavy, as if holding secrets long buried. The beam of the flashlight cut through the dark, yet it was Zane's determined steps that revealed what the house had hidden for years. What they uncovered beneath the old tiles would not only change the case, but also move every heart that heard it. Watch until the end to discover the miracle Zane brought to light. The Carroll house stood at the end of a broken road in Waller County. Its paint had peeled away until only gray wood showed. The windows were sealed with warped boards, and weeds climbed up through the porch rails. For years, the place was treated like a ghost. Children dared each other to step inside on Halloween, but even they stopped coming. It was a shell of something once cared for, now swallowed by silence. George slowed his cruiser in front of the gate. The engine ticked as it cooled. Beside him, Zane, his German shepherd partner, sat tall, ears up, nose testing the air. The dog's tail moved once slow, as if marking his unease. The call had been short and strange. A voice had whispered to the dispatcher that there was movement in the Carroll house. The report ended quickly, almost too quickly, like the caller regretted making it. The dispatcher suggested a raccoon. George knew better. He had learned to listen not just to what people said, but to the way they said it. He pushed the door open and stepped into the heavy air. Pine trees pressed close around the property, their branches tangled with vines. The gate leaned under its own rust. Zane leapt out, paws landing firm on the dirt body, tense, as if every sound mattered. George placed a steady hand on his back. The front steps sagged under his weight. The door, swollen from years of damp Texas heat, refused to move until George threw his shoulder into it. The hinges screamed as it gave way. A stale wave of air rolled out, thick with dust and mildew. Inside, the house held stillness so deep that each footstep cracked like thunder. Dust rose with every move, floating through thin lines of light that cut past broken boards. Wallpaper curled from the walls, and framed photos had fallen, their glass long shattered. George swept his flashlight across the hall. Nothing stirred, only cobwebs that swayed in the beam. Yet Zane froze. His body stiffened, ears angled forward, nose pulling in the air with sharp breaths. The dog's muscles rippled, as if holding a command George had not yet spoken. "What is it, boy?" George whispered. Zane stepped toward the rear of the house, each paw placed with care. His tail was low. His gaze locked on a narrow passage that led deeper in. George followed the floor, creaking under his boots. The sound of the old house felt alive. Groans in the rafters, faint drops of water echoing from somewhere unseen. Still, it was Zane's silence that pressed hardest. His usual quick glances had sharpened into a single focus. He was searching, and he wanted George to know it. They reached the end of the hallway, where a bathroom door hung crooked on its hinges. The air was heavier here, damp and sour. Zane lowered his head and pressed his nose near the crack. His chest lifted as he inhaled, then he stepped back with a soft whine. George steadied his flashlight and pushed the door. It swung wide with a sharp groan, showing cracked tiles and a rusted clawfoot tub against the far wall. The room carried the smell of rot and rust of years sealed shut. Zane did not wait. He padded inside, nails scraping across the tile body, low but sure. His eyes fixed on the tub, his breathing quickened, and his ears flattened as if ready for something hidden. George tightened his grip on the flashlight. He had learned long ago that Zane's instincts were sharper than any tool he carried. Whatever had drawn the dog here was not random. The silence grew heavy. The tub stood dark against the wall, its rim streaked with rust, its base lost in shadow. George stood still, eyes locked on the tub. The beam of his flashlight ran across its rusted rim, down the cracked legs, and into the shadows at its base. The smell of iron and mildew hung in the room thick enough to taste. Zane's body lowered closer to the floor. His nose brushed against the tiles, sniffing quick and sharp. Then came the first paw strike. His claws scraped the ground near the bottom of the tub. Dust rose in a thin cloud, catching the flashlight beam. George frowned. "What are you looking for?" Partner Zane pressed harder, digging against the tile. His tail stiffened, and his breaths came in short bursts. He was not curious. He was certain. The sound of his nails, raking across the floor, echoed through the small room, rough and insistent. George crouched beside him, ran his hand along the edge of the tub. The porcelain felt cold, its enamel worn to bare metal in places. Nothing looked unusual. But Zane's eyes told another story. They were wide and bright, flicking from George back to the tub as if to say, "Pay attention." A dull thump broke the silence. It was faint, almost hidden under the scrape of claws. George froze. His light followed the line of tiles at the base. One patch seemed different. The grout was cleaner, the edges too neat compared to the rest of the floor. He pressed down with his boot. The tile shifted ever so slightly, giving off a hollow sound. Zane barked once, sharp and urgent. He pawed again, harder this time, until his nails bled against the surface. George placed a calming hand on the dog's shoulder, but his own heart raced. "All right," he muttered, pulling his radio from his belt. His voice was steady, though his chest felt tight. "Dispatch, this is Officer George. I need backup at the Carroll property. Possible concealed structure. Send tools." Static crackled back in his ear. The dispatcher confirmed. Reinforcements would be there soon. Zane did not stop. Even as George tried to guide him back, the dog pressed forward, snout against the gap, breathing deep. A low growl built in his chest, steady and strong. It was not anger. It was warning. George stood again, scanning the bathroom. The cracked mirror, the peeling paint, the sagging ceiling. All signs of decay. Yet beneath that tub was something alive with tension. He could feel it in the air, in the way Zane's every muscle strained forward. Minutes felt longer as they waited. George paced the hallway once, but he never let the doorway out of sight. Zane remained fixed, claws tapping against tile like a clock. Finally, headlights cut through the vines outside. The sound of boots on the porch followed, then the call of fellow officers. George answered quickly, leading them inside. Two men carried crowbars and a sledgehammer. Another had a portable saw. The smell of oil and metal filled the stale air. George pointed at the tub. "Here." The dog found something. The others exchanged looks, but moved in without question. They braced. The tub heaved and pushed, but it held firm. The old frame was too heavy, its legs wedged deep in the floor. "Forget the tub," George ordered. "Start with the tiles." The first strike of the sledgehammer rang out, a hollow crack bouncing down the hallway. Dust fell from the ceiling. Zane barked again, pacing, eyes locked on the ground. The men struck twice more. On the third swing, a tile split. Underneath the flashlight beam caught the edge of metal. George crouched, brushing away shards. What looked back at him was not dirt, not stone. It was steel. A flat surface sealed tight into the floor. His pulse jumped. Trapdoor, one officer breathed. George felt the weight of the room grow heavier. The air carried a dampness now, as if something old had stirred beneath. He glanced at Zane, whose body stayed pressed forward, nose to the gap, ears alert. George whispered more to himself than to the others. "This house has been hiding more than dust." The men began clearing the rest of the tiles, the sound of tools striking echoing through the hollow walls. With each blow, the smell from below grew stronger. Musty wet touched with something metallic that made George's throat tighten. Zane let out another sharp bark, then lowered his body tail. Stiff eyes unblinking on the steel hatch, George stepped back. flashlight steady on the dark outline forming in the floor. His chest tightened with a mix of fear and resolve. The steel hatch was now exposed in the center of the broken tiles. Its surface was scarred, but it had no handle, no hinge, no sign it was ever meant to be opened. It looked as if someone had welded it shut, burying it beneath the bathroom, like a secret no one was supposed to find. George knelt again, running the beam of his light across the seams. A thin line of rust traced the edges, but the rest was clean, too clean for a house left to rot for more than a decade. "Get the saw ready," he ordered. One officer powered up the portable blade. Sparks flew as the teeth bit into the steel. The noise was sharp, rattling through the small room, echoing against cracked walls. Dust shook from the ceiling. Zane backed a step, ears pinned, but he never looked away from the hatch. The smell grew worse as the cut deepened. Damp air seeped through the seams, heavy with mold, and something faintly metallic, like old blood. George covered his mouth with his sleeve, eyes stinging from the sting of rust and decay. Almost through, the officer shouted over the screech of the blade. Sweat ran down his forehead, glowing in the flashlight beams. Finally, with one last groan, the hatch gave way. The steel plate shifted and lifted, just enough for them to grip it. Together, two men pulled, muscles straining, until the slab slid back with a painful grind. Cold air rushed upward. It smelled of earth that had not seen light for years. George shivered, though the night outside was warm. The darkness beneath stretched deep, the beam of his flashlight swallowed before it reached the bottom. "Jesus," one of the younger officers muttered. "It just keeps going." George leaned closer, shining his light into the opening. Stone steps, narrow and uneven, disappeared into black. The walls below looked reinforced with old timber and rusted metal. It was no simple cellar. Someone had built this to last. He pulled his radio again. "Control, we have uncovered a concealed passage under the Carroll property. Appears to be man-made. Request immediate backup and safety gear." Static crackled, then the dispatcher confirmed. More units were on the way. Zane lowered himself beside the hatch, nose twitching, a low rumble rising in his throat. His tail stayed rigid, his eyes never blinking. "You sense it, don't you?" George murmured, scratching the back of the dog's neck. "Whatever's down there, it's waiting." The air around the bathroom seemed to press closer, as though the whole house had been holding its breath for years. The officers shifted uneasily, their boots crunching against broken tiles. No one wanted to be the first to step down. George swallowed and looked at Zane. The dog met his eyes, steady and ready. That bond, forged on countless patrols, was enough. George felt the knot in his chest loosen just slightly. He clipped the lead onto Zane's harness and straightened. "We go down first," he said. One officer shook his head. "You sure about that?" George nodded. "Zane knows when to stop. Trust him." They positioned lights around the bathroom beams, pointed toward the opening. Shadows stretched long and jagged across the walls. The air grew colder, rising in steady waves from below. George placed his boot on the top step. The stone felt damp, slick under his sole. He adjusted his grip on the flashlight, heart steadying into a slow, strong beat. Behind him, the officers fell silent. Every sound now came from the earth itself, the faint drip of water, the creak of wood, the breath of the dog beside him. George looked down into the black void. It seemed endless. Zane leaned forward, sniffed once, then gave a short bark that echoed into the hollow below. George tightened the lead. "All right, partner. Let's see what they wanted to hide." With that, he began the descent. Zane pressed close at his side. The cold grew sharper with each step. The smell of mold thickened, clinging to the throat. And then from somewhere deep in the dark, a sound drifted up. Soft, faint, almost like a whisper. George froze on the stair. Zane's ears shot forward. The dog's body tensed, every muscle alive with warning. George raised his hand to signal silence. The others above leaned closer, listening. The whisper came again. Fragile, inhuman. George's heart hammered. The whisper floated through the tunnel again, thin and uncertain. Like air leaking through broken stone, George held his breath, straining to catch it. Zane's body leaned forward, every muscle drawn tight. His nose twitched, pulling in the damp air, then he gave a low whine that shivered against the silence. Step by step, George moved deeper down the stairs. The walls pressed close, rough timber beams, slick with moisture. His flashlight beam trembled across the stone, cutting only a narrow path of light into the dark. Behind him, the scrape of boots followed, but no one dared speak. The whisper rose once more, clearer now. Words seemed to shape through, broken by distance. George could not tell if it was a child or something else entirely. The sound scratched at his nerves. "Easy," he whispered down to Zane. The dog's ears twitched, but he did not look back. His focus was locked ahead on whatever lay beyond the bend of the stair. The air grew colder. The smell of mold thickened into a heavy weight laced with something sharper, metallic, that burned at the back of the throat. Each breath tasted like rust. At the bottom of the stair, the tunnel opened into a narrow hall. The floor was damp puddles reflecting the thin beams of light. George's boots splashed softly as he stepped forward. The noise echoed far, bouncing through unseen chambers. "Fan out, George," ordered, his voice low but firm. Two officers raised their lights to the walls. They revealed crude reinforcements. Old wood, bent metal plates, nails driven deep. It looked like someone had worked hard to keep this place hidden and to keep whatever was inside from getting out. The whisper came again, stronger now. George froze. It sounded close, just past the next corner. The voice was soft, almost trembling, like someone calling in their sleep. Zane pulled on the lead nails, scraping across stone. He growled deep and steady, not with rage, but with certainty. He had found the source. George raised a hand. The team slowed their steps, moving with the care of men crossing thin ice. Their beams of light swung forward together. The tunnel turned into a small chamber. The air was thick, almost unbreathable. Blankets lay piled in the corners, dirty bottles scattered across the floor. Crayon drawings covered the concrete walls. Shapes of houses, stick figures, flowers colored in bright reds and blues. The images made George's chest tighten. This was not a lair for animals. Someone had lived here. Zane sniffed at the drawings, then lowered his head to a heap of blankets. His nose pressed into the fabric, and his tail gave a sharp flick. A whimper followed, high and human. George's light swung to the far wall. A section of stone looked wrong, patched with newer mortar. He stepped closer, touched the surface. Hollow. "Here," he said. "Help me clear it." The men pressed their shoulders to the wall, prying at loose bricks. The sound of stone cracking filled the chamber. Dust fell, mixing with the damp air. Then it came. The whisper again, this time broken by a cough. Fragile but real. George's breath caught. His eyes met Zane's for a heartbeat. The dog gave a short bark, then pressed both paws against the wall. "Get it open," George ordered. His voice shook but held firm. The last brick fell with a heavy thud. Behind it was a narrow iron door, its paint long flaked away. Rust streaked down its surface. From the other side came the faint sound of breathing. Zane pressed close, his nose, almost touching the door ears, angled forward. A soft whine escaped his throat, as if he knew exactly who was waiting beyond. George lifted his light to the rusted handle. His chest tightened. The room was silent, the air alive with tension. "On me," he said, gripping the handle. The officers braced tools ready. The door groaned under the first pull, metal grinding against stone. Then from behind it, the faintest voice called out. A plea, barely more than a breath. Help. George's hand trembled on the handle. He looked down at Zane, whose steady eyes seemed to answer without words. The iron door screeched as it gave way, flakes of rust breaking loose and falling to the ground. George pushed harder, his shoulders straining until the hinges bent and the door opened wide enough for his light to cut through. The beam fell across a small room, low and narrow, the walls damp with dark stains. In the corner lay a bundle of cloth so still, it almost blended with the shadows. Then the fabric shifted and small faces emerged. 3 children huddled together under a filthy blanket. Their eyes reflected the light like glass wide and frozen. Pale skin stretched thin across their cheeks. None of them spoke. They only stared, their silence louder than any scream. Zane stepped forward first. George let the lead slip loose, trusting the dog's judgment. The German shepherd lowered himself close to the ground, ears soft, tail tucked but steady. He approached with care, stopping a few steps short. One of the children, a boy, flinched at the sight of movement. His hand clutched tighter around the edge of the blanket. But Zane did not press. He lay down flat, resting his head against the floor, and let out a quiet whine. The sound broke the stillness. The youngest child, a boy no older than 5, reached out with a trembling hand and touched the fur on Zane's muzzle. The dog stayed still, breathing slow as if offering his strength. A sob followed. Then another. The girl, perhaps 7, buried her face in the blanket and wept. The older boy pulled them closer, but his own tears slipped free. George's throat tightened. He stepped inside slowly, lowering his flashlight so it did not blind them. He knelt beside Zane, his voice soft. "You're safe now. No one will hurt you." The children clung to each other, their shoulders shaking as weeks of fear poured out. Their cries echoed through the chamber, filling the stale air with something human again. George motioned for the officers behind him to wait. He did not want to overwhelm the children with too many strangers at once. Instead, he let Zane remain the bridge. The dog licked the girl's hand gently, then pressed closer, allowing the children to bury their fingers in his fur. "Good boy," George whispered, though his own eyes burned. Minutes passed before the sobs slowed. The children sat curled against Zane, breathing unsteady but calmer. George noticed the older boy studying him, cautious but curious. His lips parted as if to speak, then closed again. George did not push. He only said, "My name is George. This is Zane. We're here to take you out of this place." The boy's gaze flicked back to the door, then down to the damp floor. His silence was heavy, but George recognized it. This child carried words he did not yet trust to share. George placed a hand on the cold stone. "We'll listen when you're ready," he said. The team outside the door began moving supplies in. Blankets, water, a first aid kit. The officers worked quietly, setting them down without making sudden moves. George accepted a flask and offered it forward. The girl reached for it with shaking hands. She drank, then passed it to her brothers. Zane's steady presence held the moment together. He nudged the oldest boy once, then rested his head in the boy's lap. The boy's fingers tightened in the fur, and for the first time he whispered, "My name is Brody." George met his eyes, voice calm. "Brody, you did well. You kept them safe." The boy blinked, his lips trembling as if fighting between fear and relief. Then he leaned forward, burying his face in Zane's neck. George let the silence linger. The air was still damp, the walls still heavy with secrets. But inside this room, the first steps of trust had begun. And George knew when Brody spoke again, the truth about who had put them here would change everything. The chamber had fallen quiet again. The children clung to Zane as if he were the last solid thing in their world. George stayed close, crouched low so his voice would not carry like a command, but like a promise. Brody wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. He was thin, his shoulders hunched, but there was something steady in the way he held his younger brother and sister. Survival had made him older than his years. George waited. He knew forcing words would only push the boy deeper into silence. Instead, he placed a blanket across the girl's shoulders and set a bottle of water near Brody's hand. Zane lifted his head, nudging Brody once more, and that small gesture broke something open. The boy's lips parted. His voice cracked, but clear enough. "She called herself Ba Raven," he whispered. George's chest tightened. The name landed like a stone dropped into deep water. He had heard it before in murmurs among older cases, but never with proof. Now it came from a child's mouth, and it felt heavier than any report. "Who is she?" George asked, keeping his tone calm. Brody's eyes flicked toward the iron door, then back down. "She was the one who brought us food. She said she was taking care of us, but it wasn't true. She hurt some of the kids when they cried." The younger boy whimpered at the memory, hiding his face against Zane's fur. The girl rocked back and forth, whispering under her breath, too soft for George to hear. Brody's words grew steadier. It wasn't only her. There were others. Men who wore gloves. They never showed their faces. They came at night. They picked some kids and took them away. George leaned closer. Took them where Brody shook his head, frustration clear in his small features. "She told us they were going to special places. But the kids didn't want to go. They begged to stay. She still sent them." His voice cracked again, and he pressed his forehead into Zane's fur. George closed his eyes for a moment, steadying his breath. The name, the pattern, the mention of others. This was no small crime. It was organized. Zane shifted, resting his head on Brody's lap. The boy's breathing slowed as his hands sank into the thick coat, pulling comfort from the dog's warmth. George spoke softly. "How long have you been here?" Brody hesitated. "I don't know. We lost track. It was always dark. Only sometimes she brought a lantern." He paused, then whispered, "There were more kids when we first came. 6 of us. Now it's just 3. The girl lifted her head, her eyes wide with fear. "They took them," she whispered, echoing her brother. "Ba Raven said they were chosen. She said if we were quiet, we could stay. If not, we would go too." George felt anger burn low in his chest. He forced it down and kept his voice steady. "You are safe now. No one will take you anywhere again." But even as he spoke, his mind turned to the missing ones. If 3 were here, then others were still out there. Maybe close, maybe already gone. Above, the sound of radios crackled. More officers were arriving. The children would soon be carried into the light. But George knew their words would echo long after. He looked at Zane, who met his eyes as if already leading the way forward. The dog's ears twitched toward the tunnel, then back again, restless. George stood pressing a hand to Brody's shoulder. "You've done more than you know, son. You've given us a path." Brody looked up, eyes still wet but steadier. "She will come back," he said, voice barely audible. George's hand tightened. "Then we'll be ready." The team began lifting the children out, wrapping them in fresh blankets, carrying them up the stone stairs one by one. Zane lingered at the doorway, nose tilted to the air as if already searching for the next trace. George followed him into the tunnel. The smell of damp wood and stone pressed close, but another thought pulled sharper. If Ba Raven had been moving children, there had to be more places, more hiding spots waiting in the woods. And Zane, nose low to the ground, was already leading him toward the trees. The night outside felt heavy, thick with the smell of pine and damp earth. George stepped out of the Carroll house, lungs filling with air that was fresher than the basement, yet still sharp with tension. Behind him, officers carried the rescued children toward waiting ambulances. Their cries were softer now, wrapped in blankets, guided into the care of paramedics. But George's focus was already turning to Zane. The dog had not relaxed since they climbed from the tunnel. His ears twitched, his nose lowered, and his body leaned forward as if pulled by something deeper in the woods. George clipped the lead loosely to Zane's harness. "Show me," he murmured. Zane set off with a steady pace, paws crunching across the leaf-strewn ground. His tail was stiff, his stride certain. George followed flashlight beam, bouncing across tangled brush. The forest pressed close on both sides, the only sound the quiet rhythm of paws and boots. The trail was not obvious, but Zane moved with confidence, weaving between trees, nose-brushing bark, and fallen branches. At times he stopped, sniffed hard at the air, then pressed forward again. George felt the same knot of unease he had in the basement. The dog was tracking something more than scent. It was instinct. After 10 minutes, Zane slowed. His body lowered steps, careful. Ahead, George's light caught the outline of a structure. An old cabin slumped beneath a blanket of vines, its roof sagging walls gray with rot. George paused at the edge of the clearing. The cabin looked abandoned decades ago, the kind of place hunters once used and then forgot. But Zane pulled hard on the lead, urging closer. The front door leaned open. George nudged it with his boot. It swung inward, revealing a single room empty except for broken shelves and piles of wood. Dust swirled in the beam of his light. The air smelled of mold and old smoke. Zane moved first, padding across the floorboards. His nose went straight to the far wall. He sniffed, then pawed at the wood nails clicking against the rough boards. George joined him, shining the light higher. That was when he saw them. Dozens of names etched into the wood with something sharp. Small, shaky letters, some pressed deep, others barely visible. Names of children. Some were simple. Sarah, Kyle, Maddie. Others were half-finished, as if carved in haste. A few were scratched out, the lines gouged over and over until the wood splintered. George reached out, running his fingers across the grooves. The wood was rough under his skin, but the weight of it pressed harder. Each name was a mark of someone who had been here. Someone who had waited. Someone who might never have left. His jaw clenched. The evidence was not just about one house or one hidden basement. This was a system, a chain, the kind of cruelty that stretched wider than anyone wanted to believe. Behind him, one of the officers stepped inside. "Sir, what is this place?" George shook his head slowly, eyes fixed on the wall. A holding point. A place to keep them quiet when people came close. Zane whined softly, pressing his nose against the lowest part of the wall where the names grew crowded as if younger children had carved them. His tail-lowered body heavy with the weight of the discovery. George took a step back, shining the light across the rest of the room. In the corner near the floor, another mark caught his eye. Not a name this time. A symbol. 3 short lines above a circle etched over and over. The sight made his chest tighten. It matched nothing he had seen before, yet it felt deliberate, like a signature. The wind outside rustled through the broken shutters, carrying a faint smell of damp soil. George turned toward the door, but Zane was already moving. The dog pressed his nose against a gap in the floorboards, sniffing hard. He barked once sharp and pawed at the ground. George dropped to one knee, brushing away the dirt. The floor shifted under his hand. A seam, a hatch. His breath steadied. He looked at Zane, who stared back with unblinking eyes. "Another tunnel," George whispered. The hatch creaked as George pried it open, wood and soil breaking loose around its edges. A stale breath of air escaped from below, damp and sour, touched with the faint scent of rust. His flashlight beam slid into the opening, catching rough steps carved straight into the earth. He looked down at Zane. The dog's ears were forward, his nose already pressed toward the dark tail, stiff with alert. "All right, partner," George murmured. "Let's see where this goes." The officers formed a line behind him, lights ready. George clipped the lead onto Zane's harness, then lowered himself into the narrow shaft. His boots sank into cold soil, the walls pressing close as he descended. The tunnel stretched forward, a corridor of dirt and timber supports. Moisture clung to the beams, dripping in steady rhythm. The air was thick, heavy with mold. Each breath felt borrowed. Zane led the way, paws steady, head low to the ground. He sniffed left and right, then pulled hard toward the incline ahead. George let the lead extend, trusting the dog's nose more than his own senses. The tunnel sloped gradually upward. After a few minutes, faint drafts of fresh air slipped down from above, cool against George's face. His pulse quickened. This path was not meant to stay hidden underground forever. It was a passage, a way out. They pressed deeper. The soil walls grew tighter, the air colder. Their lights caught marks carved along the beams, scratches, gouges, places where wood had been clawed or cut. George ran his fingers across one. Small, the size of a child's hand. His chest tightened. He steadied himself and moved on. Zane stopped suddenly, his body frozen, ears tilting toward the silence. Then he lunged forward, nose pressed against a patch of loose earth along the right wall. He barked once sharp, the sound echoing down the passage. George crouched and brushed away soil. His light revealed fabric caught in the dirt, a piece of a sleeve worn thin, too small for an adult. He tucked it into a bag, jaw clenched. "Keep moving," he told the team. The tunnel widened, curving toward the left. A faint hum of water grew louder with each step, steady and distant. Zane pulled harder now, almost dragging George forward. The incline rose until the ground leveled into a broad end wall of timber and stone. At first it seemed sealed, but a draft whispered through cracks in the boards. George pushed his shoulder against one beam, and it shifted just enough to reveal light. The officers worked together, prying at the boards until they collapsed outward. Cool night air rushed in sharp with the scent of pine and creek water. They stepped out into a gulch, the moon casting pale light over mossy rocks and tangled vines. Ahead through the trees, the water of Miller Creek shimmered faintly. George stood in the opening, scanning the woods. His light swept across damp soil, catching impressions along the ground. Not fresh, but clear enough. Small footprints mixed with larger ones, leading away from the tunnel. He crouched, tracing one print with his hand. Children had come through here, and they had not been alone. Zane paced along the path, nose pressed to the dirt. His tail flicked body tense with each step. He let out a low growl, then pressed forward, pulling toward the creek. George's eyes narrowed. "You've got the trail, don't you?" The dog barked once sharp and sure. His chest rose, quick with purpose, every line of his body pointing toward the stream. George rose, glancing back at his men. This wasn't just a hiding place. They moved them through here, toward the water. The sound of Miller Creek grew louder, rushing fast under the cover of trees. The thought pressed heavy in George's chest. If this passage was part of a system, then there would be more. Places waiting beyond the creek. Zane barked again, pulling him forward. His nose was locked, his body alive with certainty. George steadied his light on the path ahead. "Lead on, partner. Show us what's waiting." The rush of Miller Creek grew louder as George and his team pressed through the undergrowth. The beam of his flashlight cut across thick vines and broken branches, while Zane moved ahead with unshaken purpose. His nose stayed low, his stride quick, pulling hard on the lead. The creek finally appeared, its water glimmering under the moonlight. The air was damp, filled with the sound of rushing current against rocks. On the far bank, half hidden under tangled roots, George spotted something unusual. A concrete wall square, and unnatural, jutted out from the soil. Zane barked, claws scraping against the ground as he pulled toward it. George raised a hand to his men. "There," he said, pointing at the wall. The officers waded through shallow water and cleared brush from the structure. A narrow metal door was set into the concrete, rusted, but still intact. Its frame was reinforced as if someone had built it to keep intruders out, or keep secrets in. George pushed on the handle. It resisted, but two men added their strength until the hinges groaned and gave way. The smell that poured out made everyone step back. Damp earth mold, and something older, sharper. He swung his light inside. A narrow stairway dropped into the ground. Timber supports lined the walls slick with moisture. George clipped Zane's lead again. With me. They descended slowly, the air growing colder, heavier. At the bottom, the passage widened into a chamber. Concrete walls closed in and water dripped steadily from above. Old crates sat stacked in one corner, their wood swollen from damp. Zane sniffed along the floor, then stopped. His paw pressed against a pile of debris, nose fixed on something hidden beneath. He barked once, sharp and urgent. George knelt, pushing away the boards. His light revealed a metal box, scratched and dented. It was heavier than it looked when he lifted it. A lock hung broken across its front. He pried the lid open. Inside, neatly arranged, were old cassette tapes. Their labels were smudged, but one still carried clear writing voices. George's chest tightened. He pulled the tape recorder from the box, brushed the dust from its surface, and pressed play. At first came only static crackling in the damp air. Then a voice rose high and trembling. A child's voice. "Please, let us go. We'll be quiet. We promise." Another voice overlapped, weaker, coughing between words. "It's dark. I don't want to stay here." The chamber filled with the sound of children begging, their small voices echoing against the concrete walls. One cried, calling for a mother who would never come. Another whispered prayers over and over until the tape cut out. George froze his throat tight. The officers around him shifted uneasily, their lights trembling in their hands. No one spoke. The evidence was undeniable, a record of suffering hidden beneath the earth. Zane whined, pressing close against George's side. His eyes locked on the recorder as if he understood the weight of what it carried. George shut the box, his jaw clenched. "Bag it," he ordered, his voice rough. "Every piece." One of the younger officers whispered, "Sir, this isn't just proof. This is a message. They wanted to be heard." George met his eyes, steady and cold. "Then we'll make sure the world listens." Above, the night air carried faint sounds from the forest. An owl's call, the rush of water. But for George, the children's voices still echoed, refusing to fade. He glanced at Zane, who was already staring toward the woods beyond the creek body, tense again. The dog sniffed the air and barked once, sharp and certain. George rose the box, heavy in his hands. His gaze followed Zane's line of focus. Through the trees, barely visible, sat the faint outline of another structure. A house. Its paint faintly yellow, even in the moonlight. George's chest tightened. He had heard whispers from Brody and the others. The yellow house. He clipped Zane's lead tighter, his voice low. "It's time." The yellow paint peeled in strips across the siding, faded and cracked from years of weather. Yet even in the moonlight, its color stood out against the dark trees. George tightened his grip on the box in his hand, his jaw hard. This was the place the children had whispered about. He signaled his men. They spread out, rifles raised flashlights, cutting beams through the long grass. The wind carried the smell of damp wood and gasoline, sharp and unsettling. Zane stood at George's side body, low eyes fixed on the sagging front porch. His chest lifted quick with each breath, nose twitching. He gave a short, steady bark. "Confirm presence," George said, under his breath. The officers stacked at the door. George moved to the front, one hand gripping Zane's harness. He counted down with his fingers. On 3, the ram struck. The old frame split wood shattering as the door gave way. Inside, the air was heavy colder than the night outside. Curtains covered every window, shutting out the world. The faint hum of a generator buzzed somewhere in the back. George swept his light across the room, a couch under a sheet, a broken lamp, a table set with a plate of crumbs. Someone had been here recently. Zane pulled hard on the lead, dragging George toward the narrow hall. His claws scraped the floorboard's tail, stiff as a rod. He barked again, sharper now. "Go," George ordered. They followed Zane through the hall. On the left, an old staircase rose to the second floor. On the right, a door hung half open to a small kitchen. Plates still dripped on the rack as if washed not long ago. Zane ignored it all. He pressed toward a locked panel under the stairs. George crouched, ran his hand along the frame. It was small, barely wide enough for a child. "Get me a pry bar," he ordered. An officer passed it forward. George jammed it into the crack. With one sharp pull, the wood split. The door flew open, and a rush of sour air escaped. Zane lunged through before George could stop him. His bark echoed, then softened into a low whine. George ducked inside, flashlight raised. The crawl space opened into a rough basement room. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, buzzing like flies. In the corner, on a thin mattress, sat a girl. She was small, maybe 8 or 9. Her hair hung in tangled strands over her face. In her arms, she clutched a worn stuffed bear. Her eyes widened at the sudden light, but she did not scream. She was already touching Zane, her small hand buried in the fur at his neck. George lowered his voice. "It's all right. You're safe now." The girl looked up slowly. Her lips trembled, but no sound came. She only held tighter to the dog, pressing her face against his coat. George crouched near. "What's your name?" She hesitated, then whispered, "Joanna." The name hit him with a wave of relief and sorrow. He had hoped she was real, that the children's whispers were more than fading memory. Now she was here alive, clinging to his dog, as if he were the only anchor she had left. Zane settled beside her, his body curved protectively around her small frame. Joanna's fingers stayed locked in his fur. Every time someone else moved closer, she shrank, but she never let go of Zane. George gave the order to clear the rest of the house. Officers moved upstairs, searching every room. More signs of recent use. Clothes in a closet, a half-burned notebook. But no other children. He stayed with Joanna, letting her lean into the dog's warmth. Her breathing steadied, though her eyes never left the doorway, as if expecting someone to return. George met her gaze. "You're safe now," he repeated. Her lips parted. This time she whispered words that chilled the room. "She said I was the last one." George's chest tightened. The dog's ears flicked at the sound. Joanna lowered her head into Zane's neck and held him tighter. George stayed crouched near the mattress, his flashlight lowered so it would not blind the girl. Joanna's words replayed in his mind. The last one. Her fingers curled deeper into Zane's fur, as if the thought of losing that anchor was unbearable. The German shepherd stayed still, chest rising in calm rhythm, his warmth steady against her trembling frame. George softened his voice. "Joanna, can you tell me who said that?" Her eyes flicked toward the ceiling, as if she expected the answer to drop from above. Then she whispered, almost too soft to catch Ba Raven. The name weighed heavy in the stale air. George exchanged a glance with one of his officers. They had confirmation now. The woman was real, and she was still moving children through these places. "She told me I was special." Joanna continued, her voice breaking. "She said I would be the last." Then she laughed. "She said the others were already gone." George's stomach turned. "Gone where?" he asked gently. Joanna shook her head. "She never told us. just said they were chosen. She said if I stayed quiet, I would stay here until she came back. She promised. Zane licked her hand softly. The girl pressed her face into his neck, drawing courage from the touch. George waited, letting silence give her room. Finally, Joanna lifted her head. Her eyes were wide, too old for her small face. She said this house was only one of many. She said there are others painted different colors, waiting for children. George's chest tightened. This was bigger than he had feared. Not one house. A system. A network hidden in plain sight. He placed a steady hand on the floor, grounding himself. Joanna, do you remember anything else? Symbols, words, places? The girl hesitated. Then she pointed toward the wall where faint chalk lines marked the paint. George raised his light. 3 short strokes above a circle carved again and again the same symbol he had seen in the cabin. She drew it everywhere, Joanna said. She said it was her mark. She said if we ever saw it, it meant she had been there. George swallowed hard. The pattern was no longer coincidence. It was a signature left behind, as if daring them to follow. The officers finished clearing the house and returned with updates. No one else inside. Tracks outside suggested the place had been used in the past weeks, but there was no trace of where the others had been taken. George stood his shadow stretching long across the faded yellow walls. He looked down at Joanna, still pressed against Zane. "You're safe with us," he said again. "And you've given us something important. We will find the others." Her lips trembled. "You have to hurry." She said once the last one is taken, the houses will be closed forever. The words cut sharp. George exchanged a grim look with his men. Time was shorter than they thought. Zane gave a low whine, nudging Joanna's arm. She clung to him tighter, her small body shaking. George crouched again, lowering his voice to a promise. "We'll stop her. You won't be the last." Joanna's eyes glistened. She gave no reply, but her fingers stayed tangled in Zane's fur, refusing to let go. George rose, his mind racing. The symbol. The talk of many houses. The threat of closing them forever. The picture was growing darker, but also clearer. Secure the girl. Get her to medical, he ordered. She doesn't leave the dog's side. As officers prepared the exit, George cast one last look at the flickering light above the peeling yellow paint and the etched marks on the wall. This house had given them a clue, but it was only a piece of something much larger. And Zane, nose tilted toward the floorboards again, was already pulling him to the next place where answers waited. The convoy moved deeper into the forest before dawn. Guided by Zane's relentless nose and the threads of evidence collected from the yellow house. The dog's ears pricked with every shift of the wind, his body taut with direction, as if he carried the memory of every child who had passed through these woods. George walked at his side, flashlight low. He could feel the weight of Joanna's words still pressing on him. Once the last one is taken, the houses will be closed forever. That threat echoed louder than the river rushing behind them. The trail broke at a clearing where an old storage building sagged beneath a roof of rusted tin. Its windows were black holes, its door chained with rust. Zane growled low, his body's stiff tail bristling. George raised his fist. "This is it." The team cut the chain and pushed the door open. The smell hit first. Damp earth mildew and something faintly sweet, like dust clinging to fabric long abandoned. Their light swept the interior, revealing a staircase descending into a cellar. Zane lunged toward the steps. George followed. The basement was larger than he expected, the walls concrete lined with shelves. At first the items looked ordinary. Boxes, crates, stacks of bags. But when George lifted his light, the truth revealed itself. On the shelves sat toys. Dozens of them. Dolls with missing eyes. Stuffed animals rubbed bare from clutching hands. Tiny shoes lined in pairs, some stained, some worn through. George's throat tightened. He moved closer, running his fingers across a row of notebooks stacked in a crate. He opened one. The handwriting inside was small, looping, uneven. A child's words. Pages filled with thoughts about hunger, fear, and a desperate wish to go home. Another officer called from the far side. "Sir, you need to see this." George crossed the room. Against one wall, nailed into a frame, hung drawings. Houses, trees, smiley faces, and beneath them, written in crayon names, different from the ones carved into the cabin wall. These were new, fresh enough that the colors had not yet faded. Zane whined, circling a shelf where more belongings were stacked. He pawed at a small box, his nails scratching against the lid. George lifted it down and opened it slowly. Inside lay a row of necklaces, bracelets, and small trinkets, keepsakes once held by little hands. The sight hollowed him. "This is their room," George said softly, almost to himself. Their lives stored like evidence. The silence was broken only by the faint hum of the generator in the corner, its low vibration reminding them this place had been maintained. Someone had been coming back. George's chest burned. He shut the box and turned to his team. "Bag everything. This isn't just evidence. It's proof of who they were." An officer's flashlight beam shifted across the far wall. A door nearly hidden by stacked crates came into view. They moved the debris aside and forced it open. Inside was a smaller chamber, narrower, colder. Here the shelves were bare, except for one object, a large corkboard nailed to the wall. Papers covered its surface, pinned in jagged rows. Some were maps, others handwritten notes. And at the center was the same symbol. 3 short lines above a circle, scrawled again and again. George stepped closer, his light steady. The notes listed locations, some with check marks, others with lines drawn through them. He recognized towns in his own state, but also places farther away. Zane sat at his side, eyes fixed on the wall, ears twitching. George's hand found the dog's harness. "This isn't local," George said, his voice low but firm. "This stretches farther." The air in the room seemed to grow colder as the truth settled. What they faced was not a single crime scene, but a system crossing borders. George's jaw clenched. "We need to find the full map. Wherever it is, that's the key." Zane barked once, sharp and sure, his sound echoing against the concrete walls. The corkboard loomed in the narrow chamber, its edges curling with damp, its surface crowded with papers that looked as if they had been rearranged and replaced 100 times. George steadied his light on it, reading each detail slowly. Pinned near the top was a larger sheet, folded and worn. He pulled it free and spread it against the wall. It was a map. Not just of Waller County, not even just of Texas. Lines crossed state borders, stretching outward like veins. Small red circles marked towns, most in rural areas, far from main roads. Some were checked, some scratched through, others marked only with a strange symbol, 3 lines over a circle. George's chest tightened. "It's all connected," he whispered. Zane sat close, his eyes fixed on the map as if sensing its weight. His ears flicked at every rustle of paper, his nose twitching at the scent of old ink and dust. One officer leaned closer, pointing. "Sir, that's Louisiana. And here, Arkansas, Missouri. This thing runs north, maybe farther." Another spoke, his voice uneasy. "These symbols, they look like designations. Each mark could be a house or a site." George pressed his fingers against one cluster. 4 circles lined in a row, 3 crossed out, 1 left open. "Stages," he said grimly. They moved the kids through one stop at a time. The thought made his stomach turn. It wasn't chaos. It was a system. In the corner of the board, pinned with a rusty nail, was a scrap of paper. A list of names. Some had lines through them, others were underlined. At the bottom, one stood alone, Joanna. Next to it, a note scrawled in hurried letters, the last. George's hand curled into a fist. He thought of the girl upstairs clinging to Zane as if the dog were her only shield. She had been marked as the final piece in this place's cycle. "We're not stopping here," George said. His voice was steady but iron hard. "This isn't one county's case. This is bigger. We get this to federal, to anyone who can act fast. These kids don't have time." Zane whined softly, pressing his nose against George's hand as if agreeing. An officer brought forward a box they had found under the corkboard. Inside were rolled maps folders and what looked like blueprints. George opened one and found a detailed sketch of a tunnel system, complete with arrows pointing toward water routes and bridges. At the bottom in faint pencil was a name, Carter Bridge. George's breath caught. "Here, this is the next site." The men leaned over their flashlights, casting sharp angles across the page. Carter Bridge was an old overpass decommissioned decades ago. Locals avoided it, claiming it was unsafe. That made it the perfect hiding place. George folded the map and slid it into his jacket. He turned to his team. "Gear up. We move now. If they've taken others, Carter Bridge is where we'll find them." The officers exchanged tense glances, but no one argued. They packed the files and sealed the chamber, leaving its chilling trophies behind. As they stepped into the early morning air, the forest around Miller Creek felt different. The night silence carried a weight, as if the trees themselves had heard the children's cries on those tapes. Zane padded ahead, nose lifted to the wind. His body vibrated with restless energy, his instincts already pulling toward the next trail. George followed, his jaw set. The system was wider than he had feared, but now they had a direction. The bridge would not stay hidden much longer. The convoy stopped at the edge of Carter Bridge just as dawn broke over the horizon. The rusted frame of the overpass loomed ahead, its concrete supports streaked with moss and vines. Beneath it, the ground was littered with trash, burned-out barrels, and torn tents left by squatters. George stepped out his boots, crunching gravel. The air smelled of iron and stagnant water. Zane leapt from the vehicle, nose to the ground, tail stiff. His body was tense every step, deliberate, pulling toward the far support beam. George followed, heart pounding. "Show me, partner." Zane stopped at a slab of concrete, half buried under dirt. He barked sharply, paws scraping against the surface. George knelt, pressing his palm flat. It sounded hollow. "Get this open," he ordered. The team brought tools, prying until the slab groaned and lifted. A draft of cold air rose damp and sour, carrying a metallic tang that tightened George's throat. He clipped Zane's lead and lowered himself into the dark. The tunnel below stretched narrow, and dry beams braced against the walls. They moved cautiously, lights cutting through the gloom. Every step echoed like a warning. Then Zane froze. His ears shot forward, nose twitching. He growled low, pulling the lead until George almost stumbled. "What is it?" George whispered. From the far end of the tunnel came a faint sound. Metal clinking, then a cough. George's blood ran cold. He lifted his flashlight. At the end of the corridor stood a steel cage, welded bars thick and rusted. Inside, curled into a corner, was a boy. "Brody," George breathed. The child lifted his head slowly, blinking against the light. His face was pale, his eyes hollow from fear. But when they fell on Zane, they lit with something alive. "I knew you'd come," Brody whispered. His voice cracked and weak. George rushed forward, gripping the bars. "We've got you, son. Hold on." The cage had no key. The lock was welded shut. Officers brought tools, sparks flying as they cut through the iron. Zane pressed his nose between the bars, whining. Brody reached out his small hand, brushing the dog's muzzle. The sight pulled a knot tight in George's chest. The boy's fingers curled in the fur, refusing to let go even as the lock screeched under the grinder. "Come on," George urged, sweat beading at his temple. "Get it open." Finally, with a sharp snap, the lock broke. The door swung wide. Brody stumbled forward, but his legs gave out. Before George could reach him, Zane lowered his body to the ground, sliding close enough for the boy to collapse into his side. Brody clung to the dog's neck, burying his face into the thick coat, his shoulders shaking with sobs. The tunnel seemed to hold its breath. No words, no sound, just the image of a child clinging to a dog who had never once given up the trail. George swallowed hard, his eyes stinging. He laid a hand on Brody's back. "You're safe now. We've got you." The boy whispered, his face still pressed against Zane. "He saved me. I waited. I knew he would come." George glanced at his team. Even the hardest of them looked shaken, their lights trembling against the walls. "Let's move, George," said his voice rough. "Get him out of here." As they carried Brody toward the surface, Zane stayed close, his body curved low so the boy's small arms never had to let go. At the top of the tunnel, morning light spilled across the ground. For the first time, Brody closed his eyes, safe in the warmth of fur and daylight. George looked back at the darkness beneath the bridge. Something else waited there. They had saved one child, but the system that had built these cages was still alive. And Zane's nose, twitching again, turned toward another passage branching off the tunnel. George steadied his light. "There's more," he said grimly. The second tunnel under Carter Bridge sloped downward deeper into the earth. The air grew colder with each step, heavy with the scent of dust and damp stone. Zane moved ahead, his paws quiet but purposeful, ears angled forward, like he already knew what waited. George followed, jaw set. Brody was safe above, but the system that had held him still pulsed somewhere in these shadows. After 50 yards, the corridor opened into a wider chamber. The beam of George's flashlight caught something that made him stop cold. Screens. Dozens of them mounted along the concrete walls. Their pale glow flickered in the darkness, powered by a humming generator in the corner. Wires snaked across the ceiling and into the ground, carefully hidden from above. An officer's voice broke the silence. "Sir, these are live." George stepped closer. The monitors showed different locations, some familiar, others not. One displayed the Carroll House basement empty now, except for the marks left behind. Another showed the yellow house, its windows boarded, but still lit by faint interior bulbs. Others revealed barns, sheds, and forest clearings, all marked by the same symbol scratched into a corner of the feed. "This isn't one group working alone," George said, his voice low. "This is coordinated." Zane growled softly, nose pressed toward the screens. He circled once, then sat close to George's leg, as if waiting for confirmation that what they were seeing was real. One screen caught George's eye. It showed a narrow hallway lined with doors, each door marked by numbers painted in red. He leaned closer. A small shadow passed across the frame. Too small to be an adult. His chest tightened. There are still kids in some of these places. The officers moved quickly, photographing every screen, every wire, every detail. Evidence that this was no longer a local matter, but a network stretching across counties, maybe states. In the corner, a desk held papers scattered in disarray. George flipped through them. Supply logs, burner phone numbers, coded lists of names. One sheet bore a heading in block letters, "Rotation." Underneath were dates and initials, marking when children were moved. His hand trembled as he read the truth, sinking deeper. They weren't just hiding children. They were moving them like pieces on a board. Zane pressed against his leg, grounding him. George breathed once, steadying. "Secure this place," he ordered. "Every wire, every note, every second of footage." His men moved at once, cataloging each detail with grim focus. But the unease in George's chest grew heavier. If they were watching so many sites, then others were likely watching them now. The generator sputtered, lights flickering. George glanced at the cables. "They'll know we're here soon," he warned. One of the younger officers looked up, pale. "You think this feeds back to them?" "I don't think," George said. "I know." The room felt tighter suddenly, the glow of the screens less like light and more like eyes staring back. He shut off one monitor, then another, until only a few remained. He pocketed a hard drive sitting on the desk, small and black. Evidence that might hold the recordings of everything they had just seen. Above them, the sound of water rushing under the bridge echoed faintly, a reminder of how close the surface was. But down here, the system's pulse was alive. George looked once more at the screen showing the numbered doors. The image burned into his mind. "This isn't a county case anymore," he said, his voice steady. "This is interstate. Maybe bigger." Zane barked once sharp, the sound bouncing off the concrete. It felt like agreement, like a vow. George turned to his men. "We're pulling out. There's more ground to cover. And if the maps are right, the next stop is an old poultry farm. That's where we'll find the next piece." He looked down at Zane, whose eyes stayed locked forward. "Lead on, partner. We're not done yet." The road to the abandoned poultry farm cut through fields long overgrown. The structures rose ahead. Rows of collapsed barns, their tin roofs twisted, their wooden beams blackened with rot. Once a place of noise and life, now it stood silent, a hollow frame against the early morning sky. George parked at the edge of the property. The air smelled of rust hay, long gone sour, and faint traces of oil. Zane jumped from the vehicle, nose to the wind ears twitching. His body tightened as he pulled toward the largest barn. "Fan out," George ordered, his voice low. "No one goes alone." The officers spread through the property lights, cutting through the dim interior of the barns. Dust rose with each step, swirling in beams of light that cut through broken slats in the walls. George followed Zane into the heart of the first building. The floor was littered with feathers and cracked boards. Old cages hung open, their wire rusted and bent. But Zane ignored it all. His nose pulled him to a mound of debris near the back wall. He barked once sharp, then began pawing furiously. George knelt, brushing away the dirt and straw. His hand hit something solid. A canvas bag, water-stained and heavy. He dragged it into the light, the weight of it pulling at his arm. "Got something?" George called. The team gathered as he unzipped the bag. Inside were folders, dozens of them, their corners warped from damp. He pulled one free, his chest tightening as photographs spilled into his hand. Children. Faces, pale eyes wide, some smiling faintly, others hollow with fear. Each photo was labeled with a name, an age, and a date. George's throat burned. He opened another folder. Inside, the same pattern. Medical records, behavior notes. One page read in neat clinical print, "Compliant. Suitable for transfer." Zane whined, pressing his nose into George's shoulder, as if sensing the weight of what he held. In the bottom of the bag lay a ledger, its cover worn but intact. George opened it slowly. Rows of names filled the pages, each followed by a single word stamped in thick black ink. Kept. The sight hollowed him. Page after page, line after line, the word repeated. Some names were crossed out, others underlined. It was not just a record. It was a judgment, cold and final. George closed the ledger with a snap, his jaw clenched. Around him, the officers stood silent, their faces pale. The barn's creaks and groans sounded louder, as if the walls themselves carried the weight of the children whose names were written inside. "This is their system," George said, his voice low. "Every name, every child, cataloged like inventory." An officer shifted uneasily. "Sir, what does kept mean?" George stared at the bag, the files spilling across the floor. "It means they weren't meant to leave. These were the ones held back. And we don't know why." The silence thickened, broken only by Zane's steady breathing. He pressed closer to George, his warmth grounding him in the cold truth of the barn. George zipped the bag and stood, his eyes scanning the shadowed rafters above. "Get this out. Every page, every photo. Secure it all." As his men packed the evidence, George noticed a rolled paper wedged in the corner of the bag. He pulled it free and spread it across a broken crate. It was a rough drawing marked with arrows and symbols. At the bottom, scrawled in faded pencil, was a note: Carter Bridge. Lower chamber. George's pulse quickened. The bridge again. But deeper. They had not yet seen all of what lay beneath. He looked at his men, then down at Zane. The dog's eyes were sharp, ears pricked, as if he too understood. "This isn't over," George said. His voice carried through the empty barn like a vow. "We go back, and this time we finish it." The paper lay open across the broken crate, its surface wrinkled and faint with age. George bent low, tracing the lines with his finger. The sketch was crude but clear enough, a series of tunnels running beneath Carter Bridge, branching deeper than what they had explored. One corner was circled in red pencil. Beside it, written in hurried strokes, were the words, "Lower chamber." George's chest tightened. "We didn't even touch this level," he said. The officers crowded closer, their flashlights trembling as they studied the drawing. One of them shook his head. "If this is accurate, we've only seen the surface. There's more below. Much more." Zane pawed at the paper, his claws scraping across the ink. His nose pressed close, as if even the faint smell carried meaning. George rubbed his neck, unsettled by how restless the dog had grown since they left the bridge. "This wasn't just a holding tunnel," George said quietly. "This was a facility, built to last." The barn felt heavier with the realization. The creak of its rafters sounded almost like voices, warning them of what lay beneath the ground. George rolled the paper carefully and slipped it into a protective sleeve. He looked up at his team. "We take this to command. We're going back to the bridge. But this time we don't scout. We move with full force." The officers exchanged tense glances, but no one objected. They had seen enough to know hesitation could cost lives. By the time the convoy returned to town, the sun had dipped low, staining the horizon with deep orange. George spread the map across a table in the precinct's briefing room. Around him sat his officers, along with federal agents who had been pulled in after the discovery of the surveillance chamber. The room hummed with low voices. But when George began to speak, silence fell. "This isn't an abandoned site," he said, pointing to the circled chamber. "This is active. And if the files are correct, children have been moved here in the last 2 weeks." A federal agent leaned forward. "You're certain?" George nodded. "We found records at the poultry farm. Detailed, consistent. And every piece points back to Carter Bridge. The lower chamber is the hub." The agent's jaw tightened. "Then we don't wait. We mobilize." The next hours blurred into preparation. Tactical gear was issued. Blueprints were studied. Teams were assigned points of entry. Zane lay at George's feet, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes sharp, following every movement in the room. The dog's stillness carried weight, like he already knew the fight ahead. George crouched and rubbed his ear. "It's almost time, partner. One more trail." When darkness settled, the convoy rolled again toward Carter Bridge. Engines hummed low. Radios crackled with clipped orders. Floodlights stayed off, leaving only the pale glow of the moon to mark their way. They parked a half-mile out and moved on foot. The forest swallowed their sounds boots soft against damp soil. As the bridge came into view, its rusted skeleton loomed like a warning. Beneath it, shadows seemed to pulse darker than the night itself. George raised his hand, signaling the team to halt. His breath came slow and steady, though his pulse raced. "This is it," he whispered. "We go in quiet. Zane leads." The dog stood body taut, ears high. His nose pointed toward the hollow beneath the bridge, and without hesitation, he stepped forward. George followed his team, fanning out behind him, their lights ready but dimmed. The entrance yawned before them, stone and steel, black and endless. The air that seeped out carried the damp chill of something waiting. George steadied his rifle and clipped Zane's lead. "On me," he said. The descent began. The tunnel beneath Carter Bridge swallowed them whole. Flashlights cut narrow beams through the dark, bouncing off damp concrete. Every sound seemed amplified. The drip of water, the shuffle of boots, the steady pant of Zane's breath. George moved at the front, one hand on his rifle, the other steadying the lead. Zane's nose worked the air, his stride quick, purposeful. The dog stopped suddenly, ears snapping forward. A growl rumbled low in his chest. George raised a hand. The team froze. Ahead, the tunnel widened into a chamber. The light revealed iron bars lining the walls, rows of cages. Inside, shapes shifted, small and fragile. Children. One officer whispered, his voice cracking. George's heart hammered. He stepped closer. Tiny faces blinked against the harsh light, pale and thin eyes wide with silent terror. No screams came, only the sound of shallow breaths and muffled sobs. "Get those doors open," George ordered. Tools struck, metal sparks flying as locks gave way. Officers moved fast, wrapping blankets around trembling bodies, lifting them out one by one. But Zane wasn't done. He pulled hard, dragging George deeper into the chamber. His paws skidded across the floor until he reached a cage at the far end, smaller than the rest. His nails scratched the bars as he barked, sharp and urgent. George swung his light inside. His chest tightened. Brody. The boy sat curled in the corner, his arms wrapped tight around his knees. His face was streaked with dirt, his lips pale, but his eyes lit the moment they found Zane. "George." His voice cracked, thin but alive. George's throat closed. "We're here, son. We've got you." Officers rushed forward, cutting at the lock. Brody pressed closer to the bars, reaching out a trembling hand. Zane lowered himself, pressing his nose through the gap, whining deep in his throat. The boy's hand found the dog's fur. His small fingers clutched tight, and for the first time since George had met him, Brody let go of silence. He cried. Not the quiet sobs of before, but deep, broken sobs that shook his thin frame. The lock snapped. The cage swung open. Brody stumbled out, but his legs gave way. George reached for him, but Zane moved faster. The dog lowered his body, pressing close so Brody could collapse against him. The boy buried his face in the thick coat arms, clinging tight. Zane stayed perfectly still, his chest rising steady, his eyes calm. He let the child cry into his fur, tears soaking through shoulders, shaking with the release of everything he had carried in silence. George crouched beside them, his hand trembling as it rested on Brody's back. "You're safe," he whispered, his own voice thick. "You held on, and now you're safe." The chamber filled with movement, officers guiding children out, radios crackling with updates. But in that corner, time seemed to stop. It was only a boy and a dog, one pouring out his pain, the other holding it all without a word. When Brody's sobs slowed, he lifted his face, eyes red but clearer. He pressed his forehead to Zane's muzzle. "I knew you'd come," he whispered. Zane's tail thumped once against the floor. George blinked hard, steadying his breath. He stood scanning the room. They had freed them, yes, but something still pressed at the edges of his mind. The system that had built this place was too large, too organized to end here. As the last child was carried toward the exit, George's light caught something on the wall. A message scrawled in black paint. "You found the lambs, not the wolves." His chest tightened. Ba Raven's shadow still lingered. He turned toward his men, his voice hard. "This isn't over. Not by a long shot." Zane's ears twitched. His eyes stayed locked on the words, as if he understood. The words on the wall bled into the beam of George's flashlight. "You found the lambs, not the wolves." Each letter was jagged, scrawled in haste, but with intent. A taunt. A challenge. George's jaw tightened. "She was here," he said. One of the officers shifted uneasily. "You think Ba Raven wrote this?" "No." George replied, his voice low. "I know she did." Zane growled a deep, steady sound that echoed against the concrete. His eyes stayed fixed on the message, as if it were alive. George stepped closer. The paint was still faintly tacky to the touch. She had been here recently, maybe hours ago. The thought sent a surge of frustration through him. They were close, yet still a step behind. "Bag it," George ordered. "Samples, photos, everything. If she left a trace, we'll find it." As the team worked, George's mind ran back through the evidence. The maps, the ledgers, the tapes. Every piece pointed to a network too complex for one person to manage. Ba Raven wasn't acting alone. The message confirmed it. The wolves were still out there hidden. Brody was carried past on a stretcher, Zane pacing alongside, refusing to leave the boy's side. The child's hand stayed tangled in the dog's fur, even as paramedics checked him. Joanna followed close behind, her wide eyes darting nervously until they landed on George. She gave a small nod, as if silently asking him to keep his promise. George bent near her. "You're safe," he said softly. "We'll keep you that way." But even as he spoke, the words on the wall burned in his mind. Outside, the first glow of dawn spread across the horizon. The bridge's rusted beams stood like broken ribs against the sky. Officers moved quickly, loading evidence into vans, securing the children for transport. Yet the mood was heavy, their relief tangled with unease. George stood apart, watching the water rush below the bridge. His reflection stared back, fractured by the current. Zane pressed against his leg, grounding him in the moment. "This isn't done, partner," George murmured. "Not until we find the wolves." A federal agent approached, carrying a folder filled with preliminary notes. "Collins, the lab's already flagged something. The handwriting on that wall matches notes recovered in a raid up north last year. Oregon, same symbol, same style." George turned sharply. "Then it's not just here." The agent nodded grimly. "No, it's bigger. Multi-state, maybe more." George exhaled slowly, the truth pressing heavier than the dawn. He had always feared this was part of something wider, and now the proof was in front of him. Zane lifted his head, ears twitching. He gave a short bark, sharp and certain. George glanced down. "Yeah, boy, she's still out there." The convoy pulled away from the bridge sirens, silent engines humming low. Inside, the rescued children huddled under blankets. Brody dozed with his face pressed into Zane's fur, the dog lying across the floor of the van like a shield. Joanna sat nearby, her hand clutching a crayon one of the officers had given her. She drew on scrap paper, her strokes quick and uneven. Houses with windows, flowers, and the yard light pouring from the sky. George watched her from across the van, his chest heavy. For these two, there was a chance at healing. For the others, still missing the fight, had only begun. As the van rattled along the road, he looked out at the endless stretch of forest. The shadows seemed alive, carrying secrets that refused to die. The words replayed in his mind, cold and final. You found the lambs, not the wolves. George rested a hand on Zane's back. The dog's steady warmth was the only anchor he needed. We'll find them, George whispered into the hum of the road. Every last one. The care facility sat on a quiet stretch of road, its white fences bright under the midday sun. The building itself was simple. Painted walls, wide windows, and a garden where flowers leaned toward the light. It wasn't much, but compared to the darkness they had pulled the children from, it was another world. George stood just outside the door, arms folded, Zane at his side. The dog's ears twitched as the laughter of children carried faintly from inside. It was thin, fragile, but real. Through the glass, George could see Joanna and Brody seated at a long table with paper spread before them. Crayons rolled across the surface as their small hands worked. Brody leaned forward, his tongue between his teeth in concentration, while Joanna drew with quick, certain strokes. George stepped closer to the window. He watched as Joanna held up her picture. It showed a house. Not the yellow prison of her past, but something new. A bright home with wide windows open to the sun. Flowers bloomed under them, tall and colorful. Above it she had drawn a sky painted blue with birds flying free. Brody added his own touch, sketching a dog in front of the house, its ears tall, its body strong. Even in crayon, George knew who it was meant to be. Zane. The boy's lips curved into the faintest smile as he pressed the crayon harder, filling in the dog's coat with bold strokes. George felt his chest tighten. These were only drawings, but they carried something weightier than words. They were hope fragile and new, taking shape in hands that had known only fear. Behind him, an officer approached. They'll be staying here under round-the-clock care. Trauma specialists, security, everything they need. For now, they're safe. George nodded, his eyes still fixed on the children. Safe. A word that felt temporary in the world he now knew. But for these two, it was real enough today. Zane pressed closer to his leg, his tail brushing lightly against George's boot. The dog's eyes stayed locked on the children, inside ears pricked, body relaxed in a way George hadn't seen in weeks. He seemed to understand that his work, at least for this moment, was done. George crouched, rubbing Zane's ear. You did it, partner. You brought them out of the dark. The dog leaned into his hand, quiet and steady. George looked back toward the road, stretching away from the facility. The fight wasn't over. The files, the maps, the message on the wall, they all pointed to something larger. The wolves were still moving in the shadows, and he knew he would not rest until they were dragged into the light. But here today, he allowed himself to pause. Inside, Joanna laughed. Light bright, the sound of a child finally freed from silence. Brody grinned, holding his picture of Zane high, showing it proudly to the staff. The room filled with color, with drawings of windows and flowers of skies unchained. George turned away from the glass. He didn't need to see more. He carried the image in his mind, a reminder of what they were fighting for. He placed a hand on Zane's harness. Come on, boy. Let's give them their peace. They walked back toward the gate. The sun was warm on George's face, the air alive with the scent of grass and soil. For the first time in a long time, the weight on his chest eased. The road ahead would be long. The system they had uncovered stretched far beyond, one bridge, one county. But today, 2 children had been returned to the light. And as Joanna's pictures showed, even after the darkest nights, there could still be a house with windows open to the sun and flowers blooming at the sill. George glanced down at Zane, whose stride was steady beside him. One step at a time, he murmured. The dog's tail wagged once firm and certain. Together, they walked on, into a world still haunted by shadows, but no longer without hope. Stories like George and Zane's are not just about darkness and danger. They are also about what rises in the face of it: loyalty, compassion, and the unbreakable bond between a human and a dog. Every step Zane took through abandoned houses, hidden tunnels, and cold chambers was a reminder of what animals can give us. Courage without hesitation, devotion without condition, and a love that does not falter even in the darkest places. The German Shepherd is often recognized for strength, intelligence, and discipline. But this story reminds us of something deeper. Zane's power was not only in his ability to track and protect. It was in the way he gave comfort to children who had forgotten how to trust, in the way he became a safe place for Brody's tears, and in the way he silently stood guard over Joanna's fragile hope. He showed that healing often begins not with words, but with presence. This tale also leaves us with a call to value and care for animals, not only for what they can do, but for who they are, companions capable of extraordinary empathy. To recognize that kindness, whether from a person or a dog, can tip the balance between despair and survival. And to remember that every life, no matter how small, deserves safety, light, and love. Zane's journey with George closed one chapter, but the message carries forward: where there is loyalty, there is strength. Where there is compassion, there is healing. And in every German Shepherd that walks beside us, there is the promise of both.